Barren Kept Secrets. Magnolia Maggie Sullivan had always played it safe, never betting more than she could afford to lose. But when Cass Boone slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and knowing, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned in, fingers brushing against hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Walk away, or take a gamble on me." Chapter 1. The Devil's Bargain at Dawn. The first sliver of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale, bruised purple, barely illuminating the dusty main street of Redemption, Arizona. Magnolia Maggie Sullivan stood on the weathered porch of the Golden Nugget Saloon, the rough wood groaning softly beneath her worn boots. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint, lingering aroma of last night's whiskey and regret. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her bones, a chill that had little to do with the desert morning. It had been 6 months since her husband, Thomas, had died, leaving her with a mountain of debt and a ranch teetering on the brink of ruin. 6 months of quiet desperation, of trying to hold onto the only life she'd ever known. 6 months of watching the vultures circle, their eyes gleaming with the promise of easy pickings. And Cass Boone was the biggest, boldest vulture of them all. He'd arrived in Redemption just a week ago, a stranger with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a smile that promised both pleasure and peril. He moved with a quiet confidence, a predator's grace that made her skin prickle with unease. He'd watched her, studied her, with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and seen. It was unnerving, this feeling of being dissected, of having her vulnerabilities laid bare. The memory of last night sent a shiver down her spine. The smoky haze of the saloon, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversations punctuated by bursts of raucous laughter. She'd gone there seeking solace, a momentary escape from the crushing weight of her worries. Instead, she'd found herself facing Cass Boone across a worn, scarred table, a deck of cards between them. He hadn't forced her to play. He hadn't even suggested it, not at first. He'd simply sat there, nursing a glass of whiskey, his gaze never leaving her face. It was the way he looked at her, as if he knew her secrets, her fears, her deepest desires, that had drawn her in. A moth to a flickering flame. "You got a heavy heart, Mrs. Sullivan," he'd said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. "I can see it in your eyes." She'd bristled at his presumption, at the way he'd dared to intrude on her grief. "My heart is my own business, Mr. Boone." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Everything's business in Redemption, sugar. Especially a woman alone, trying to hold onto a ranch that's drowning in debt." His words had struck a nerve, a raw, exposed nerve that she'd been desperately trying to protect. She'd glared at him, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Boone." "I never said you were," he'd replied, his gaze unwavering. "But hard work ain't always enough. Sometimes you need a little luck." He'd slid the deck of cards toward her then, his smirk slow and knowing. She remembered the feel of the cards beneath her fingertips, the smooth, worn surface a stark contrast to the rough, calloused hands of the man across from her. The scent of him, a blend of leather, tobacco, and something wilder, something untamed, had filled her senses. Cass Boone slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and knowing. She knew she was in trouble. He leaned in, fingers brushing against hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Walk away, or take a gamble on me." She'd hesitated, her mind racing. She knew it was a fool's game, a desperate gamble with stakes far higher than she could afford. But the alternative, the thought of losing the ranch, of losing everything Thomas had worked so hard for, was unbearable. It was a slow, agonizing death, a whittling away of her spirit until there was nothing left but dust and despair. Her fingers, seemingly of their own accord, had closed around the deck. The cards felt heavy, weighted with the burden of her decision. She'd looked up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What are the stakes, Mr. Boone?" His smile had widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Everything, Mrs. Sullivan." everything you have, and everything you could have. The game had been a blur, a whirlwind of cards and whispers, of calculated risks and desperate hopes. She'd played with a reckless abandon she had known she possessed, driven by a primal need to survive. And she'd lost. Lost everything. Now, standing on the porch of the saloon, the rising sun casting long shadows across the dusty street, she felt the full weight of her folly. She'd gambled and lost, not just her ranch, but her future. Her pride. Her very soul. A figure emerged from the saloon, the silhouette dark against the growing light. Cass Boone. He walked towards her with that same easy grace, that same unsettling confidence. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes searching her face. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Sleep well?" The sarcasm was subtle, but it stung. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. "I made a mistake, Mr. Boone. A terrible mistake." "We all make mistakes, sugar," he said, his eyes holding a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. "It wasn't pity. Perhaps understanding? The question is, what are you going to do about it?" She looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks now bathed in the golden light of dawn. She didn't know. She truly didn't know. The future stretched before her, a vast, empty expanse, as desolate and unforgiving as the desert that surrounded her. She was lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no anchor, no compass, no hope. But a flicker deep inside. A refusal to be fully extinguished. Chapter 2. Shadows of the past whispered. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. The only sounds were the creak of the saloon sign swaying gently in the morning breeze and the distant caw of a crow. Maggie finally turned back to face Cass, her gaze steady, though her heart still hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the words a raw whisper that seemed to scrape against her throat. "I've lost everything." Cass tilted his head, his eyes, those unsettlingly perceptive eyes, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, to hide. But she held his gaze, refusing to show him the full extent of her despair. He had won, fair and square, according to the twisted rules of their desperate game. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "You haven't lost everything, Maggie," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He took a step closer, the scent of him leather, tobacco, and that elusive wildness wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. It was a strange comfort, a dangerous comfort. "My ranch, it's all I have," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. "It's my home, my history, my husband's legacy." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "I understand legacy, Maggie. More than you might think." There was a flicker of something in his eyes then, a shadow of pain that flitted across his features so quickly she almost missed it. It was a glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade, a hint of a past that was as shrouded in mystery as the man himself. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued despite her predicament. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the dusty street, to the distant mountains that seemed to hold their own secrets. "I had a ranch once," he said, his voice low and rough. "In Texas. My father's ranch. It was everything to me." He paused, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. "I lost it. Through my own stupidity. My own youthful arrogance." The confession surprised her. She hadn't expected vulnerability from him, this man who seemed to exude such an air of invincibility. It humanized him, made him seem less like a predator and more like a fellow traveler on a difficult road. "How?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own, a pain that resonated deep within her soul. "Gambling," he said, the word a bitter taste on his tongue. "I thought I was invincible. I thought I could outsmart anyone, outplay any hand. I was wrong." He shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile twisting his lips. "Lost it all in a single night. To a man who cheated, a man who used marked cards and a loaded gun. I was young, foolish, and unarmed. The story resonated with her, the echo of her own loss, her own foolish gamble, reverberating through her. She saw a reflection of herself in his pain, a shared understanding of the devastating consequences of reckless choices. "I'm sorry," she said, the word sincere, heartfelt. He shrugged, a dismissive gesture that didn't quite mask the lingering pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. I've learned my lesson, the hard way. And now you collect debts?" She asked, the question a challenge, a test. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I collect what's owed to me, Maggie. Just like you're going to collect what's owed to you." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his stormy gray eyes. "I'm saying I'm going to give you a chance to win it back." Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within her chest.
"How?"
He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver of both anticipation and apprehension down her spine. "We're going to work together, Maggie. You and I. We're going to take back what's rightfully yours." "Work together?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You want to help me?" "Let's just say I have my reasons," he said, his gaze holding hers captive. "And I have a proposition for you. A new gamble, if you will. But this time, the odds will be in your favor." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket, its surface intricately engraved with swirling patterns. It was familiar, achingly familiar. She'd seen it before this. "This was Thomas's," she said, her voice trembling. "He always wore it. Said it was a good luck charm, passed down from his grandfather, a prospector during Gold Rush." Cass nodded.
"He told me about it."
"Said it was the only thing of value he had left, besides the ranch. He offered it to me as collateral before we started playing." She reached out, her fingers tracing the delicate engravings on the locket. It was a tangible link to her husband, a reminder of the love they had shared, the life they had built together. The weight of it in her hand was both comforting and heartbreaking. "I want you to have it back," Cass said, his voice soft. "Consider it a sign of good faith." He held it out to her, his eyes watching her intently. She hesitated, her mind reeling. This was a twist she hadn't anticipated, a gesture of kindness from a man who had seemed so ruthless just hours before. Was it a trick? Another game? Or was it genuine? The shadows of the past seemed to whisper around them, secrets and regrets mingling with the faint hope of a new beginning. She looked at the locket, then back at Cass, her heart torn between suspicion and a desperate yearning to believe. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around them, a silent witness to the unspoken bargain hanging in the air. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last vestiges of the dawn, illuminating a path that was both uncertain and intriguing. She reached out and took the locket. Chapter 3. A town built on broken promises. The locket felt cool and smooth against her palm, a tangible connection to a past that was both comforting and painful. Maggie closed her fingers around it, the silver warming with the heat of her hand. She looked up at Cass, her eyes searching his, trying to decipher the truth behind his enigmatic smile.
"Why?"
she asked, the word a soft whisper that barely carried on the morning breeze. "Why are you doing this?" Cass shrugged, a casual gesture that didn't quite mask the intensity in his gaze. "Let's just say I have a soft spot for lost causes," he said, a hint of self-deprecating humor in his voice. "And you, Mrs. Sullivan, are definitely a lost cause." She bristled at his words, her pride stung. "I'm not a lost cause, Mr. Boone. I'm a survivor." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Survival is just the first step, sugar. Thriving, that's the real challenge." He turned and walked towards the edge of the porch, his gaze sweeping across the dusty main street of Redemption. The town was slowly coming to life, the sounds of hammers and saws, the rumble of wagons, the shouts of children, filling the air. It was a town built on hope, on the promise of a better life, but it was also a town riddled with broken dreams and shattered illusions. This town, Cass said, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness, it chews people up and spits them out. It takes their dreams and turns them into dust. Maggie followed his gaze, her eyes scanning the familiar buildings, the weathered storefronts, the faces of the people who passed by. She knew the truth of his words. She'd seen it firsthand, the toll that the harsh realities of frontier life took on even the strongest souls. It doesn't have to be that way, she said, her voice firm, defiant. There's still good here, Mr. Boone. There's still hope. He turned back to her, his eyebrows raised in a skeptical arch. Hope is a dangerous thing, Maggie. It can blind you to the truth, make you believe in things that aren't real. And what's the truth, Mr. Boone? She challenged. That we're all just doomed to fail? That we should just give up and let the vultures pick us clean? He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver of both apprehension and excitement through her. The truth is, Maggie, that life is a gamble. You can either play it safe and lose slowly, or you can take a chance and maybe, just maybe, win big. He stepped closer, his presence filling her senses, his scent of leather and tobacco a familiar, almost comforting aroma. I'm offering you a chance, Maggie. A chance to win back everything you've lost. A chance to rebuild your life, to reclaim your legacy. And what's in it for you? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. What's your price? He met her gaze, his eyes holding hers captive. My price is simple, Maggie. I want a share of the profits. 50% of everything the ranch produces, for the next 5 years. The offer was audacious, outrageous. It was a gambler's terms, a high-stakes proposition that could either make her or break her.
But it was also a lifeline.
A chance to escape the crushing weight of debt, to hold onto the only home she'd ever known. She hesitated, her mind racing, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, expertise, someone who understood the harsh realities of the frontier, someone who wasn't afraid to fight for what they believed in. And Cass Boone, despite his flaws, despite his checkered past, seemed to fit that description. And what if I refuse? She asked, testing him, pushing him to reveal his true intentions. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. Then you walk away, Maggie. You try to survive on your own. You watch your ranch slowly wither and die, your dreams turn to dust. And I move on to the next opportunity. The words were blunt, harsh, but they held a ring of truth. She knew he wasn't bluffing. He was a gambler, a survivor, a man who knew how to play the odds. And right now, the odds were stacked against her. She looked at the locket in her hand, the smooth silver a reminder of her husband, of his unwavering belief in her strength, in her resilience. She thought of the ranch, of the land that had been in her family for generations, of the life she had built there, the memories she had made. She took a deep breath, the desert air filling her lungs, and met Cass's gaze. I accept your proposition, Mr. Boone. But on one condition. His eyebrows rose in surprise. And what's that, Mrs. Sullivan? You answer to me, Mr. Boone, she stated clearly. This is my ranch, and I will still have the final say. A slow smile graced his lips. Fair enough, partner. His eyes held a glint of something that looked suspiciously like respect. The sun was high above them, beginning to bake the earth, promising no mercy. They had struck their bargain. Now they would see if they could actually keep it. As they stood, newly allied, the shadow of the town's largest building, the bank, fell upon them. It had been one of Thomas's largest debtors and the source of much of her present worry. It was a daunting first hurdle. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Silver Locket. Maggie tucked the silver locket into the pocket of her worn denim skirt, the cool metal a reassuring presence against her thigh. It was a tangible link to Thomas, a reminder of his love and his unwavering faith in her. It was also a symbol of the gamble she had just made, the partnership she had forged with a man she barely knew, a man who was both her potential savior and her potential ruin. We need a plan, she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Cass's across the dusty expanse of a town square. The morning bustle had subsided, leaving the street relatively quiet, the heat of the midday sun already beginning to shimmer off the wooden buildings. Cass nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings, assessing, calculating. "First, we need to know exactly what we're up against," he said. "How much do you owe, Maggie? And to whom?" She sighed, the weight of her debts pressing down on her like a physical burden. "The bank holds the largest note," she said, her voice low. $5,000. Then there's Silas Harper, the cattle baron. He loaned Thomas money for seed and supplies another $2,000. And a few smaller debts, scattered around town, maybe another $1,000 in total. $8,000. It was a staggering sum, an almost insurmountable obstacle. She'd been struggling to make even the interest payments, let alone repay the principal. The thought of facing her creditors, of admitting her failure, sent a wave of shame and despair through her. Cass whistled softly. "That's a hefty chunk of change, Maggie. But not impossible. We'll start with the bank. They're the biggest threat, the ones most likely to foreclose." He turned and walked towards the imposing structure of the Redemption Bank, its brick facade a stark contrast to the weathered wood of the surrounding buildings. It was a symbol of power, of wealth, of the unforgiving nature of commerce. Maggie followed him, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. As they approached the bank, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows of the alleyway beside it. A tall, lean man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a worn leather vest and a gun belt slung low on his hips. He watched them with a cold, calculating gaze. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cass glanced at the man, his expression hardening. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice low and tight. "He's Harper's foreman, and a notorious gunslinger. Best to stay clear of him." The warning sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. Silas Harper was a powerful man, a ruthless businessman who controlled most of the land and the water rights in the valley. He was also known for his short temper and his willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. The presence of his foreman, a known killer, was a clear indication of the challenges they faced. They entered the bank, the cool, dim interior a welcome respite from the blazing sun. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and money. A nervous-looking clerk sat behind a tall counter, his eyes widening as he saw Cass approach. "Mr. Boone," the clerk stammered, his voice trembling slightly. What can I do for you?" Cass leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "We're here to see Mr. Abernathy," he said, referring to the bank manager. "Tell him Mrs. Sullivan and I have a proposition for him." The clerk hesitated, his gaze darting nervously between Cass and Maggie. I don't know if he's available, Mr. Boone."
He's a very busy man.
Cass smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a chill down Maggie's spine. "Tell him it's about the Sullivan Ranch," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And tell him it's in his best interest to see us."
Now.
The clerk swallowed hard, his face pale. He scurried away, disappearing through a door behind the counter. Maggie stood beside Cass, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement. This was a dangerous game, a high-stakes gamble with everything on the line. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a partner, a man who was willing to fight alongside her, to help her reclaim her life, her legacy. The weight of the silver locket in her pocket felt heavier now, a reminder of the past, a symbol of the future, and a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and the unwavering spirit of a woman who refused to be broken. The door behind the counter opened, and Mr. Abernathy emerged, his face a mask of cautious curiosity. The game, it seemed, was about to begin. He eyed them with open suspicion and adjusted his spectacles. "Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Boone, what is the meaning of this?" Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of endless stars. Abernathy's office was surprisingly small, cluttered with stacks of papers, ledgers, and law books. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the faint, underlying aroma of fear. The banker, A portly man with thinning hair and a perpetually worried expression sat behind a large, imposing desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Mr. Abernathy," Maggie began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart, "as you know, my husband, Thomas, had a loan with your bank." Abernathy nodded, his eyes flicking nervously between her and Cass, who stood beside her, silent and watchful, his presence a palpable force in the small room. "Indeed, Mrs. Sullivan. A substantial loan. And I must say, the payments are overdue." "I'm aware of that, Mr. Abernathy," Maggie said, her chin lifting in defiance. "But I'm here to propose a new arrangement." Abernathy raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "A new arrangement?" "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm afraid the bank is not in the habit of renegotiating loans, especially those that are already in default." "This isn't a renegotiation, Mr. Abernathy," Cass interjected, his voice smooth and confident.
It's a partnership.
Abernathy's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Cass. "A partnership? With whom, Mr. Boone?" "I'm not aware that you have any assets in this town." Cass smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. "I have skills, Mr. Abernathy. Skills that can be very valuable in certain situations." "And what skills might those be, Mr. Boone?" Abernathy asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Let's just say I'm good at persuading people," Cass said, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm good at collecting debts." The implication was clear, a subtle threat that hung in the air like the scent of gunpowder. Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting back to Maggie. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice regaining some of its composure, "are you aware of Mr. Boone's reputation?" Maggie met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I'm aware that Mr. Boone is a gambler, Mr. Abernathy. But he's also a man of his word. And he's offered to help me save my ranch." "And what does he expect in return?" Abernathy asked, his voice sharp. "A share of the profits," Maggie said, repeating the terms of their agreement. 50% of everything the ranch produces, for the next 5 years. Abernathy scoffed. "That's outrageous, Mrs. Sullivan. The bank would never agree to such a preposterous arrangement." "The bank has 2 choices, Mr. Abernathy," Cass said, his voice low and menacing. "You can foreclose on the ranch, sell it off for pennies on the dollar, and lose a significant amount of money. Or you can partner with us, give us a chance to turn things around, and potentially recover your entire investment, plus interest." He paused, his gaze locking with Abernathy's. "Which option sounds more appealing, Mr. Abernathy?" The banker hesitated, his mind clearly racing, weighing the risks and the potential rewards. He knew Cass's reputation, knew that he was a dangerous man, a man not to be trifled with. But he also knew that the Sullivan Ranch was a valuable property, a potential gold mine if managed properly. I need time to consider this, Mr. Boone," Abernathy stammered. "This is a highly unusual request." "You have 24 hours, Mr. Abernathy," Cass said, his voice firm. "We'll be back tomorrow morning for your answer." He turned and walked towards the door, Maggie following close behind. As they stepped out of the bank and into the blinding sunlight, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had planted the seed, thrown down the gauntlet. Now they had to wait. That evening, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread at a small, run-down diner on the edge of town, Cass suggested they ride out to the ranch. "I want to see what we're working with," he said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. The ride was long and silent, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the chirping of crickets. The sun had set, painting the sky in a breathtaking array of colors, from fiery orange to deep purple. As darkness fell, the stars began to emerge, a million pinpricks of light in the vast, inky expanse above. Maggie looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of awe and wonder. She had always loved the night sky, the endless expanse of stars, the feeling of being small and insignificant, yet somehow connected to something larger than herself. It was a feeling she had shared with Thomas, a quiet solace they had found together in the vastness of the desert landscape. "He loved the stars," she said, her voice soft, her thoughts drifting back to her husband. He used to say they were like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. Cass nodded, his gaze following hers. He had a poet's soul. Your husband, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. It's a rare thing, in this harsh land. They rode in silence for a while longer, the shared memory of Thomas a palpable presence between them. As they approached the ranch, the silhouette of the house and barn emerged from the darkness, a familiar and comforting sight. Cass reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the property. It's a good piece of land, Maggie, he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. Solid buildings. Good water source. With some hard work and a little luck, we can make this place thrive again. His words filled her with a renewed sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could salvage something from the wreckage of her life. She looked up at the sky, at the endless expanse of stars, and felt a surge of determination. She would fight for her ranch, for her legacy, for the memory of her husband. And she wouldn't do it alone. She had a partner, a man who was as complex and unpredictable as the desert itself, but a man who, she believed, was on her side. The night was still, silent, filled with the promise and the peril of the unknown. The air felt electric. She could feel the ranch house waiting. Empty. Chapter 6. Echoes in the empty canyons. The ranch house was dark and silent, the windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. A thick layer of dust coated the furniture, the air heavy with the scent of disuse and decay. It felt like a tomb, a monument to a life that was gone, a love that had been lost. Maggie lit a kerosene lamp, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the familiar yet strangely foreign space. It needs work, Cass said, his voice echoing in the stillness. He ran a hand along the dusty surface of a wooden table, his fingers leaving a clean streak in the grime. A lot of work. Maggie nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and determination. She had let the house go, neglected it in her grief, allowed the dust and the silence to claim it as their own.
But she wouldn't let it stay that way.
She would bring life back to this house, fill it with laughter and warmth, make it a home again. They spent the next few hours exploring the house, assessing the damage, making plans. Cass was surprisingly knowledgeable about ranching, his insights sharp and practical. He pointed out areas that needed repair, suggested improvements, spoke of livestock and crops with an expertise that belied his gambler's persona. Where did you learn all this? Maggie asked, curious about the hidden depths of this enigmatic man. He shrugged, a familiar gesture that seemed to deflect any personal inquiries. I grew up on a ranch, remember? It's in my blood. But there was something more. She sensed a deeper connection to the land, a respect for the hard work and the simple rewards of rural life. It was another glimpse behind the mask, another hint of the man he kept hidden from the world. As they worked, the silence between them became less strained, more comfortable. They shared stories, memories, fragments of their pasts. Maggie spoke of her childhood on the ranch, of her parents, of her early years with Thomas. Cass listened intently, his eyes often softening with a hint of understanding, a shared empathy for the joys and sorrows of life. He spoke less of his own past, offering only glimpses, hints of a life that had been both privileged and painful. He mentioned his father, a stern and demanding man, a successful rancher who had expected his son to follow in his footsteps. He spoke of his mother, a gentle soul who had died too young, leaving a void in his life that had never been filled. She taught me to love the land, he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. She taught me to respect the animals, to appreciate the beauty of the natural world. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made him seem more human, more relatable. It strengthened the bond between them, forged a connection that went beyond their business arrangement, their shared gamble. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. They had cleaned one room, the kitchen, making it habitable, a small sanctuary in the midst of the dusty chaos. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing a pot of coffee, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. Thank you, Maggie said, her voice sincere. For everything. Cass met her gaze, his eyes holding hers. "We're partners, Maggie," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're in this together." A sudden noise startled them, a loud crash from outside. Cass was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he said, his voice sharp, alert. He moved silently towards the door, his body tense, his senses heightened. Maggie watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. The danger was real, the threat palpable. This was the frontier, a land where violence was always a possibility, where survival depended on vigilance and a willingness to fight. He cautiously opened the door, peering out into the darkness. Maggie held her breath, her eyes fixed on his silhouette. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. Then, she heard him chuckle, a low, relieved sound. "It's just a coyote," he said, stepping back inside, his posture relaxing. "Probably after the chickens." Maggie let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with the release of tension. She hadn't realized how frightened she had been, how vulnerable she felt in this empty house, in this wild, untamed land. Cass looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "You all right?" She nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a little jumpy." He sat back down at the table, his gaze lingering on her face. "You don't have to be afraid, Maggie," he said, his voice soft. "I'll protect you." The words, spoken with such sincerity, such conviction, sent a warmth spreading through her, a feeling of safety, of security, that she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, at this complex, enigmatic man who had become her partner, her protector, and, perhaps, something more. The echoes of the empty canyons seemed to whisper around them, secrets and promises mingling with the faint scent of coffee and the lingering fear of the unknown. Outside, a horse whinnied. Cass stiffened again. "That wasn't a coyote," he stated. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom's Call. Cass moved to the window, his eyes narrowed, peering out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds, casting the landscape in deep shadow. The only light came from the flickering lamp inside the kitchen, creating a small circle of illumination in the vast emptiness. "Someone's out there," he said, his voice low and tense. "And they're not friendly." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She rose from the table, her legs trembling slightly. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Could be Harper's men," Cass said, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Or someone else." Redemption wasn't just a town beset by outlaws and cattle barons. There were prospectors, drifters, and all manner of individuals looking to strike it rich, or simply escape their past. Any one of them could be a threat. He turned to her, his eyes serious. "Stay here, Maggie, and keep the lamp low. I'll go check it out." She wanted to protest, to tell him to stay, to not put himself in danger. But she knew he wouldn't listen. He was a man of action, a man who faced danger head-on, a man who protected those he cared about. And, she realized with a jolt, she was starting to care about him, more than she should. He slipped out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Maggie stood by the window, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the house and the distant howl of a coyote. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to hold a potential threat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of Cass, any indication of what was happening outside. She imagined the worst, picturing him facing down Harper's men, outnumbered and outgunned. The thought sent a wave of fear and dread through her. Suddenly, she heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove, her only weapon, and moved towards the door, her body trembling, her mind racing. She had to help him. She couldn't just stand here and wait, helpless and afraid. She had to fight, for her ranch, for her future, and for him. She cautiously opened the door, peering out into the darkness. The gunshots had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She could see nothing, hear nothing. She took a tentative step outside, the skillet held high, her eyes scanning the shadows.
Cass.
She called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She took another step, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find him. She had to know if he was all right. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, moving towards her with a swift, silent grace. She raised the skillet, ready to strike, her body tensed, her mind screaming in fear. Maggie. It's me. It was Cass, his face grim, his clothes dusty, a smear of blood on his cheek. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. Are you all right? She asked, her voice shaking. He nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just a scratch, he said, gesturing to his cheek. They're gone.
For now.
Who were they? She asked, her voice still trembling. Harper's men, he said, his eyes filled with anger. They were trying to scare us off. Send a message. And what message did you send back? She asked, her voice gaining strength. He smiled, a grim, determined smile. That we're not going anywhere, he said. That we're going to fight for what's ours. He took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring.
Come on, he said.
Let's get back inside. As they walked back towards the house, Maggie felt a surge of gratitude, of admiration, for this man who had risked his life to protect her. He was a gambler, a drifter, a man with a shadowed past. But he was also a man of courage, a man of honor, a man who was willing to stand up for what he believed in. Inside, he began to clean his wound. It was clear that the price of her freedom, of her ranch, was going to be steep. And it was going to be measured, at least partially, in blood. It wasn't just the bank they had to face now. Harper had made his position clear. They were at war. She looked at him, and then at the blood on the cloth. We have to get you a doctor, she said. Chapter 8. Where Trust Lies Bleeding. No doctor, Cass said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting Maggie's with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Not in Redemption. Harper has eyes and ears everywhere. A doctor would talk, and we can't afford that kind of attention. Maggie hesitated, her concern for his well-being warring with the practical realities of their situation. She knew he was right. Trust was a precious commodity in Redemption, and it was in short supply. A visit to the town doctor, even for a seemingly minor injury, could expose them to unwanted scrutiny, alert Harper to their vulnerabilities. But the wound, it needs to be treated, she said, her voice laced with worry. It could get infected. Cass shrugged, a dismissive gesture that didn't quite mask the pain in his eyes.
I've had worse, he said.
I can handle it. She knew he was trying to reassure her, to appear strong and invulnerable. But she also saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, the slight grimace that betrayed his stoicism. She couldn't just stand by and watch him suffer. I have some supplies, she said, remembering the small stash of medical remedies she had kept in the pantry. Herbs, bandages, things Thomas used to use for minor injuries. She went to the pantry, rummaging through the shelves, her hands searching for the familiar tins and bottles. She found a jar of healing salve made from a combination of local herbs, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. She also found some clean linen bandages, carefully folded and stored in a wooden box. She returned to the kitchen, where Cass sat at the table, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing the raw, angry gash on his cheek. The blood had dried, but the wound looked inflamed and painful. Let me clean it, she said, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. You don't have to do this, Maggie. I want to, she said, her voice unwavering. We're partners, remember? We take care of each other. He nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as she gently dabbed at the wound with a clean cloth soaked in warm water. The touch of her hands, the scent of the herbs, the quiet intimacy of the moment, filled the small kitchen with a strange, unexpected tenderness. As she worked, she studied his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the weathered skin around his eyes, the hint of vulnerability that he usually kept hidden. She saw the scars of his past, the marks of a life lived on the edge, a life filled with both danger and regret. Tell me about Texas, she said, her voice barely a whisper. breaking the silence that had fallen between them. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to share a piece of his past with her. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice low and rough. "A different life. But it's still a part of you," she said, her voice gentle. "It shaped who you are." He sighed, his gaze shifting to the window, to the darkness that pressed against the glass. "My father was a hard man," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and respect. "He built his ranch from nothing, carved it out of the wilderness. He expected a lot from me, more than I could give." "You ran away," she said, remembering his earlier confession about losing the ranch. He nodded. "I was young, foolish, and rebellious. I wanted to prove I was my own man, that I didn't need his approval. I ended up losing everything." "And you never went back?" she asked. He shook his head. "There was nothing to go back to. My father, he disowned me. Said I was a disgrace to the family name." The pain in his voice was palpable, a deep-seated wound that had never fully healed. She felt a surge of empathy for him, a shared understanding of the burden of family expectations, the sting of rejection. She finished cleaning the wound, applying the healing salve, and carefully wrapping it with a clean bandage. "There," she said, her voice soft. "That should do it." He touched the bandage, his fingers gently tracing the edges. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, his voice sincere. "You have a gentle touch." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a spark of attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden desire, but it was also irresistible. The moment was broken by a sudden knock on the door, a sharp, insistent rapping that startled them both. Cass was instantly on his feet, his hand reaching for his gun. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice guarded. A voice, muffled by the thick wooden door, answered. "It's Sheriff Thompson." "Open up." Maggie's blood ran cold. The sheriff. What did he want? Was it about the shooting? Had Harper already complained? Trust in this town was clearly going to be harder earned than she thought. Chapter 9. The unforgiving glare of noon. Cass exchanged a quick glance with Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of caution and suspicion. Sheriff Thompson was a complicated figure in Redemption. He was known for his strict adherence to the law, but he was also rumored to be in Harper's pocket, accepting bribes and turning a blind eye to the cattle baron's less-than-legal activities. "Stay here," Cass whispered to Maggie, his hand still resting on the butt of his gun. "And don't say anything unless I tell you to." He moved to the door, his body tense, his senses on high alert. He cautiously unbolted it and opened it a crack, peering out at the sheriff, who stood on the porch, his face grim, his hand resting on his own gun. "Evening, Sheriff," Cass said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the apprehension he felt. "What brings you out here at this hour?" Sheriff Thompson, a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and steely gray eyes, pushed the door open wider, stepping into the kitchen. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the scene, lingering on Maggie, who stood by the table, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. "Heard there was some trouble out here tonight," the sheriff said, his voice gruff. "Some shooting." Cass nodded, his expression unreadable. "A few coyotes," he said, his voice casual. "Got a little too close to the chickens." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Cass. "Coyotes, huh? That's not what I heard. I heard it was Harper's men." Cass shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "Gossip travels fast in this town, Sheriff. Especially when it's fueled by Harper's lies." "Harper claims you attacked his men," the sheriff said, his voice hardening. "Said they were just riding by, checking on his property." "His property?" Cass scoffed. "This is Sullivan land, Sheriff. And those men weren't just riding by. They were trespassing, trying to intimidate us." "Intimidate you?" the sheriff asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "And why would they do that, Mr. Boone?" Cass met the sheriff's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Because we're not backing down, Sheriff. We're going to reclaim this ranch, and we're not going to let Harper or anyone else stop us." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Maggie, his eyes softening slightly. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice a bit gentler, "are you all right?" Maggie nodded, her voice trembling slightly.
"I'm fine, Sheriff."
Just a little shaken up. The sheriff turned back to Cass, his expression hardening again. "I'm warning you, Boone," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Stay out of trouble. Don't cause any more problems in my town." "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff," Cass said, his voice calm and steady. "But I won't stand by and let Harper steal what's rightfully ours." The sheriff held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked towards the door. "I'll be watching you, Boone," he said, his voice a threat. "Both of you." He stepped out into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Cass closed the door, bolting it securely. He turned to Maggie, his face grim. "We need to be careful, Maggie," he said, his voice low. "The sheriff is on Harper's side. We can't trust him." Maggie nodded, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. They were surrounded by enemies, caught in a web of deceit and betrayal. Their fight for the ranch was going to be even harder, even more dangerous than they had anticipated. The next morning, they rode back to town, the rising sun casting long shadows across the dusty landscape. They went straight to the bank, their appointment with Abernathy hanging over them like a dark cloud. The banker was waiting for them, his face a mask of nervous anticipation. He ushered them into his office, closing the door behind them. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Boone," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "have you given my proposition any further thought?" "We have, Mr. Abernathy," Cass said, his voice firm. "And we're prepared to offer you a counter-proposal." He outlined a new plan, a more detailed and ambitious strategy for revitalizing the ranch. He spoke of raising cattle, growing crops, diversifying their operations, and expanding their market. He presented a vision of success, a promise of profitability that was both compelling and realistic. Abernathy listened intently, his eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and interest. He saw the potential, the opportunity to not only recover his investment, but to make a significant profit. "This is unexpected, Mr. Boone," he said, his voice regaining some of its composure. "I must admit I'm impressed." "So, what's your answer, Mr. Abernathy?" Cass asked, his voice sharp. "Are you with us, or against us?" The banker hesitated for a moment, his mind clearly racing. He looked at Maggie, then back at Cass, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Boone," he said, his voice firm. "The bank will partner with you." But he held up a hand, under the strict condition that you provide regular updates and keep to the agreed terms. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They had won the first battle, secured the bank's support. But the war was far from over. As they walked out the bank doors, into the bright glare of the unforgiving noon sun, they saw him, Jedediah Stone, leaning against a post across the street. Watching. Waiting. The true test was only just beginning. Chapter 10. A Dance with Danger's Embrace. Jedediah Stone pushed himself off the post, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Cass and Maggie. He was a predator, stalking his prey, and the dusty main street of Redemption was his hunting ground. He crossed the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "Well, well, well," Stone said, his voice a low drawl, his lips curling into a cruel smile.
"Look what the cat dragged in."
The gambler and the widow. Cass stepped in front of Maggie, shielding her from Stone's menacing gaze. "Leave her out of this, Stone," he said, his voice cold and hard. "This is between you and me." Stone chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Everything's between me and you, Boone," he said. "Especially when you start messing with Harper's business." "The Sullivan Ranch is not Harper's business," Cass retorted, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun at his hip. "It's Maggie's, and we're not going to let him steal it." Stone's smile widened, revealing a flash of yellowed teeth. "You got a lot of fight in you, Boone," he said, "but you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of your league. Harper ain't gonna let you get away with this." "We'll see about that," Cass said, his eyes narrowing. "We're not afraid of Harper. Or you." The tension in the air was thick, palpable. The few people who were on the street quickly dispersed, sensing the danger, leaving Cass and Maggie alone to face Stone's challenge. "You should have stayed away, Boone," Stone said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You should have taken your winnings and left town. Now you're going to pay the price." He made a sudden move, his hand reaching for his gun. Cass reacted instantly, drawing his own weapon with lightning speed. The two men faced each other, their guns drawn, their eyes locked in a deadly stare. Maggie stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, but the words wouldn't come. She was caught in a nightmare, a deadly dance between two men who were willing to kill for what they believed in. The silence stretched, taut and expectant, broken only by the distant sounds of the town. The sun beat down on them, the heat intensifying the tension, the sweat beading on their foreheads. "Don't do it, Stone," Cass said, his voice low and steady. "This doesn't have to end this way." Stone's eyes flickered, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face. He knew Cass's reputation, knew that he was a skilled gunslinger, a dangerous opponent. But he also knew that he couldn't back down, not in front of Maggie, not in front of the whole town. "It's too late for that, Boone," Stone said, his voice trembling slightly. "This is the only way." He tightened his grip on his gun, his finger moving towards the trigger. Cass mirrored his movement, his eyes never leaving Stone's. Suddenly, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hold it right there." Sheriff Thompson emerged from the saloon across the street, his gun drawn, his face grim. He stepped between Cass and Stone, his eyes fixed on the two men. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff ordered, his voice loud and clear. "Both of you." Cass and Stone hesitated, their eyes still locked in a deadly stare. The sheriff cocked his gun, the sound echoing in the silence. "I said drop them," the sheriff repeated, his voice even louder.
"Now."
Reluctantly, Cass and Stone lowered their guns, their bodies still tense, their eyes still filled with anger and resentment. The sheriff holstered his weapon, his gaze sweeping between the two men. "What the hell is going on here?" the sheriff demanded. "This is between me and Boone, Sheriff," Stone said, his voice still trembling with rage. "Stay out of it." "It's in my town, Stone," the sheriff retorted. "And I won't have any bloodshed on my streets." He turned to Cass, his expression hardening. "I warned you, Boone," he said. "I told you to stay out of trouble." "He started it, Sheriff," Cass said, his voice calm and steady. "He threatened us." "I don't care who started it," the sheriff said. "I'm ending it.
Now."
Both of you get out of here. And stay away from each other." He turned and walked back towards the saloon, leaving Cass and Maggie alone with Stone. The gunman glared at them, his eyes filled with hatred. "This ain't over, Boone," Stone hissed.
"Harper will hear about this.
"And you'll both regret crossing him." He turned and stalked away, disappearing into the crowd that had begun to gather. Cass holstered his gun, his body slowly relaxing. He turned to Maggie, his face filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, her voice still trembling. I thought she couldn't finish the sentence. The image of Cass and Stone facing each other, their guns drawn, still vivid in her mind. She had been so close to losing him, to losing everything. He took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "It's all right, Maggie," he said. "It's over.
For now."
But as they walked away, Maggie knew that it was far from over. The dance with danger had just begun, and she was in the thick of it, with him. Chapter 11. Secrets Etched in Weathered Skin. The near confrontation with Stone had shaken Maggie, leaving her with a lingering sense of unease. The violence, the threat, the constant tension, it was a world she wasn't used to, a world that Cass seemed to navigate with an unsettling ease. She realized how little she knew about him, about the life he had led before he arrived in Redemption. That evening, back at the ranch, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking spectacle that usually filled Maggie with a sense of peace. But tonight, The beauty of the sunset couldn't quite dispel the shadows that lingered in her heart. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Cass, who was cleaning his gun, looked up at her, his eyes questioning. "Face down a man with a gun," she clarified. "Risked your life." He nodded slowly, his gaze returning to his weapon. "It's not something I'm proud of," he said, his voice low and rough. "But it's a part of who I am." "Tell me about it," she said, her voice gentle, urging him to open up, to share a piece of his past with her. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the gun. He looked out at the darkening landscape, as if searching for the words, for the courage to reveal his secrets. "After I lost the ranch in Texas," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I drifted. Went from town to town, living by my wits, by my gun." "You became a gunslinger," she said, the words a statement, not a question. He nodded. "Not by choice, not at first. But it was a way to survive. A way to make a living in a world that didn't offer many options." "Did you kill anyone?" she asked, the question difficult, but necessary. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "I've killed men. Some in self-defense, some not." The admission sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath his charming exterior, the violence that was a part of his past. But she also saw the pain in his eyes, the burden of guilt that he carried. "It haunts you, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded. "Every night," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I see their faces, hear their voices, feel the weight of their deaths." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "I'm not a monster, Maggie," he said. "I'm just a man who made some bad choices, a man who's trying to find redemption." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers covering his. "I believe you," she said, her voice sincere. "I see the good in you, Cass. I see the man you're trying to be." Her words seemed to ease the tension in his body, the lines of his face softening, his eyes losing some of their haunted look. He squeezed her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For believing in me, for giving me a chance." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars emerge, the vast expanse of the night sky a silent witness to their shared vulnerability, their growing trust. "There's something else," Cass said, his voice hesitant, breaking the silence. "Something I haven't told you." Maggie looked at him, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. What other secrets did he hold? What other darkness lurked in his past? He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "The man who cheated me in Texas," he said, his voice low and tight. "The man who stole my ranch, it was Silas Harper." The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow, stealing her breath, sending a wave of shock and disbelief through her. Harper? The man who was trying to steal her ranch, the man who had sent his men to threaten them, was the same man who had ruined Cass's life? "I don't understand," she stammered. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want to complicate things," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't want you to think I was using you, using your ranch to get revenge." "But you are, aren't you?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of accusation. He shook his head. "Not entirely," he said. "Yes, I want to get back at Harper. I want to make him pay for what he did. But I also want to help you, Maggie. I want to see you succeed. I want to build something good, something lasting." His words were sincere, heartfelt, but they couldn't erase the doubt that had crept into her mind. Was he using her? Was their partnership just a means to an end, a way for him to settle an old score? The secrets etched in his weathered skin seemed to deepen. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Chapter 12. The storm breaks at midnight. The revelation about Cass's past with Harper hung in the air between them, a heavy, suffocating presence. Maggie felt a mixture of betrayal, confusion, and a strange, unsettling sense of understanding. She could see the pain in his eyes, the burning desire for revenge that had driven him for years. But she also saw the risk, the danger of letting their personal vendettas overshadow their shared goal of saving the ranch. "This changes things, Cass," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to be careful. Harper is even more dangerous than we thought." Cass nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a cold determination.
"I know," he said.
"But I'm not afraid of him. I've been waiting for this, Maggie. For a chance to make him pay." "This isn't just about you, Cass," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's about the ranch, about my future, about our partnership." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I know, Maggie," he said. "And I won't let you down. I promise you I'll protect you. I'll protect the ranch." But his words, while reassuring, couldn't completely erase the doubt that had taken root in her heart. She trusted him, she cared about him, but she also knew that his desire for revenge could blind him, could lead them both into a trap. They spent the rest of the evening discussing their strategy, making plans, trying to anticipate Harper's next move. They knew he wouldn't give up easily, that he would use every weapon at his disposal, his money, his influence, his hired guns to get what he wanted. As midnight approached, a storm began to brew, the wind picking up, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. The air was thick with electricity, mirroring the tension that had been building between them all day. Maggie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. She kept replaying Cass's confession, trying to make sense of it, trying to decide if she could truly trust him. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a loud crash from outside. She sat up in bed, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it Harper's men? Had they come back to finish what they had started? She grabbed the shotgun that she kept by her bed, her hands trembling, her body tense. She cautiously moved towards the window, peering out into the darkness. The storm had broken, the rain lashing against the house, the wind howling like a banshee. She could see nothing, hear nothing above the roar of the storm. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. The barn was on fire, flames leaping high into the sky, fueled by the wind and the dry timber. She screamed, a primal cry of terror and despair. She ran out of the house, into the storm, her bare feet slipping on the wet ground, her nightgown soaked by the rain. Cass emerged from his room, his eyes wide with alarm. "Maggie, what's happening?" "The barn," she cried, pointing towards the inferno. "It's on fire." Cass's face turned pale.
He knew instantly what it meant.
Harper. This was his doing, a deliberate act of sabotage, a message sent in flames. He grabbed a bucket and ran towards the well, Maggie following close behind. They worked frantically, filling buckets with water, throwing them onto the flames, but it was a futile effort. The fire was too intense, too widespread. They were losing the barn, losing their livestock, losing everything. Maggie watched in horror, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. Suddenly, she saw a figure emerge from the flames, a dark silhouette against the fiery backdrop. It was Jedediah Stone, his face contorted in a cruel smile, holding a burning torch. "You!" Cass shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You did this." Stone chuckled, a harsh, grating sound that was almost drowned out by the roar of the storm. "Harper sends his regards," he said. "He told you to leave. Now you'll pay the price." He turned and disappeared back into the darkness, swallowed by the storm. Cass started to run after him, but Maggie grabbed his arm.
"No, Cass," she cried.
"It's too dangerous. Let him go." He hesitated, his body trembling with fury, his eyes burning with a desire for revenge. But he knew she was right. It was a trap, a suicide mission. They stood there, helpless and defeated, watching the barn burn to the ground, the flames a symbol of their loss, their vulnerability, and the ruthless power of their enemy. The storm raged around them, a reflection of the turmoil in their hearts, the uncertainty of their future. Everything felt hopeless. The wood crackled and popped, and somewhere an animal screamed. Chapter 13. Redemption's Faint Glimmer. The dawn broke gray and somber, the storm having passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a blackened skeleton against the pale sky. The smell of smoke and charred wood hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of their loss. Maggie stood amidst the ashes, her heart aching, her body numb with exhaustion. She had lost everything. Her livestock, her supplies, her hope. She felt defeated, broken, ready to give up. Cass stood beside her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and guilt. He knew he was partly to blame, his past with Harper having brought this destruction upon them. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, his voice low and rough. "This is my fault." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears.
"It's not your fault, Cass," she said.
"It's Harper's. He's the one who did this." "But if I hadn't come here," he began, his voice trailing off. "You came here to help me," she said, her voice firm. "You offer me a chance, a lifeline.
I don't blame you."
She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers finding his. "We'll get through this, Cass," she said. "Together." Her words, her touch, seemed to break through his despair, his self-blame. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a renewed determination. "You're right, Maggie," he said. "We won't give up. We'll rebuild. We'll fight back." They spent the day sifting through the wreckage, salvaging what they could. It wasn't much. A few tools, some charred timbers, a handful of personal belongings. But it was enough to start again, enough to keep the flicker of hope alive. Word of the fire spread quickly through Redemption. People came to offer their condolences, their help. Some were genuinely sympathetic, others were merely curious, drawn by the spectacle of destruction. Sheriff Thompson arrived, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Was it pity? Or perhaps regret? "I'm sorry about your barn, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'll do what I can to find the person responsible." But Maggie knew he wouldn't find anything. Harper's influence was too strong, his reach too far. The sheriff was either complicit or powerless, and either way, he wouldn't be able to help them. As the day wore on, a surprising number of people from the town arrived at the ranch. Not to gawk, but to help. Old Man Hemmings, the blacksmith, offered to repair their tools. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the general store, brought them food and supplies. Even some of the cowboys from neighboring ranches, men who had once worked for Thomas, came to offer their assistance. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that not everyone in Redemption was under Harper's control. There were still good people, people who were willing to stand up for what was right, to help those in need. As Maggie watched the townspeople working together, clearing the debris, offering their support, she felt a surge of gratitude, of renewed determination. She wouldn't let Harper win. She wouldn't let him destroy her spirit, her community. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the ravaged landscape, Cass came to her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "I have an idea, Maggie," he said. "A way to fight back. A way to get justice." She looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver of both anticipation and apprehension down her spine.
"It's a long shot," he said.
"But it might just work. It involves calling in a few favors." He explained his plan, a daring, audacious scheme that involved reaching out to some of his old contacts, men from his past, men who owed him debts, men who were as skilled and as dangerous as he was. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it was also their best chance. It was time to fight fire with fire, to meet Harper's ruthlessness with their own brand of justice. As he laid out the details, Maggie felt a sense of excitement. A dangerous excitement. They were stepping outside the law. But perhaps that was the only place redemption could truly be found. Chapter 14. Scars that bind and burn. Cass's plan was as audacious as it was dangerous. He intended to call upon a network of contacts, individuals he'd crossed paths with during his years drifting across the frontier. These were men with checkered pasts, skilled in the art of survival, men who lived outside the law, but who adhered to their own code of honor. Men who owed Cass favors, debts that he now intended to collect. "These aren't saints, Maggie," Cass warned, his eyes serious, his voice laced with a hint of caution. "They're rough men, with rough ways. But they're loyal, And they're good in a fight. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She knew the risks, the dangers of associating with such men. But she also knew that they were their only hope, their only chance of standing up to Harper and his ruthless tactics. "How long will it take?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A few days, maybe a week," Cass said. "I've sent messages, through reliable channels. They'll come." The waiting was agonizing. Every day, Maggie scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for any sign of Cass's allies, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. She spent her days cleaning, repairing what she could, trying to restore some semblance of order to the ranch. But the shadow of the burned-out barn loomed large, a constant reminder of their vulnerability, their loss. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, she saw them. 3 riders, approaching the ranch from the east, their silhouettes dark against the fiery sky. They rode with a confidence, a purpose, that sent a shiver down her spine. Cass emerged from the house, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. He recognized them instantly, his face breaking into a rare smile. "They're here," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. As the riders drew closer, Maggie could see their faces, weathered and hardened by years of living on the edge. They were men who had seen it all, done it all, men who carried their scars, both visible and hidden, with a quiet pride. The lead rider, a tall, imposing man with a hawk-like nose and piercing blue eyes, dismounted and extended his hand to Cass. "Cassius," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's been a long time." "Jebediah," Cass replied, shaking the man's hand, a genuine warmth in his voice. "Good to see you." The other 2 riders dismounted, greeting Cass with nods and handshakes. These were men of few words, men who let their actions speak for them. Cass introduced Maggie, explaining their situation, their fight against Harper. The men listened intently, their eyes assessing, calculating. They understood the stakes, the dangers, the challenges. They were ready. Over the next few days, more riders arrived, drawn by Cass's call, answering the summons of old debts, old loyalties. They were a diverse group, a motley crew of gunslingers, drifters, and outlaws, each with their own unique skills, their own reasons for joining the fight. Maggie watched them, fascinated and a little intimidated by their presence. They were a stark contrast to the quiet, law-abiding citizens of Redemption. They were a force to be reckoned with, a wild card in the game of power that was being played out on her ranch. As she got to know them, she began to see beyond their rough exteriors, their hardened facades. She saw their loyalty, their courage, their sense of honor. They were men who had been dealt a bad hand in life, men who had made mistakes, but they were also men who were willing to fight for what they believed in, to stand up for those who needed their help. She saw a reflection of Cass in them, a shared past, a shared understanding of the harsh realities of the frontier. The scars that bound them were the very same scars that burned within him, and, increasingly, within her. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, sharing stories and laughter, Maggie felt a sense of belonging, a sense of camaraderie that she hadn't expected. She was a part of this group, this unlikely alliance, this band of outsiders who had come together to fight for justice, for redemption. The fire crackled, and one of the men began to play a mournful tune on a harmonica. The music settled in, a strange kind of peace. It felt, she realized, like hope. It felt like family. Chapter 15. The Long Road to Absolution. With Cass's allies assembled, a plan began to take shape. It was a daring, multi-pronged strategy designed to hit Harper where it hurt most, his money, his power, and his reputation. They would disrupt his cattle drives, sabotage his operations, and expose his corrupt dealings to the people of Redemption. "We need to be smart about this," Cass said, addressing the group gathered around a large map of the county, spread out on a makeshift table in the newly erected, temporary barn. "We can't just go in guns blazing. We need to be strategic, hit him where he least expects it." The men nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on the map, their minds already working, calculating the risks, the opportunities. They were experienced fighters, skilled in the art of guerrilla warfare, men who knew how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to strike quickly and disappear without a trace. Maggie, though initially apprehensive about the violence that was sure to come, found herself drawn into the planning, her mind surprisingly adept at strategy, at anticipating the enemy's moves. She had learned a lot from Cass, from his allies, from the harsh realities of her situation. She had become a fighter, a survivor, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to protect her ranch, her future. The first phase of the plan involved disrupting Harper's cattle drives, diverting his herds, scattering his livestock. It was a risky operation, but it was also a crucial one. Harper's wealth depended on his ability to get his cattle to market, and if they could prevent that, they could cripple his finances, weaken his hold on the town. Cass and his men rode out under the cover of darkness, their movements swift and silent, their tactics precise and effective. They used their knowledge of the land, their skills as horsemen, to outmaneuver Harper's cowboys, to drive the cattle into canyons, to scatter them across the vast expanse of the desert. Maggie stayed behind at the ranch, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She waited for news, for any sign of Cass, any indication of the success or failure of their mission. When they returned, days later, their faces were grim, their clothes dusty, but their eyes were filled with a triumphant gleam. They had succeeded. They had disrupted Harper's operations, inflicted significant losses, sent a clear message that they wouldn't be intimidated, that they would fight back. The next phase of the plan involved exposing Harper's corrupt dealings to the people of Redemption. Cass and his men gathered evidence, collecting testimonies from ranchers who had been cheated by Harper, from townsfolk who had been intimidated by his men, from anyone who had suffered under his ruthless rule. It was a dangerous undertaking, as Harper's influence extended throughout the town, reaching into the sheriff's office, the bank, even the local newspaper. But Cass and his men were relentless, determined to uncover the truth, to bring Harper's crimes to light. Maggie played a crucial role in this phase, using her connections in the town, her reputation as a respected member of the community, to gather information, to persuade people to come forward, to speak out against Harper. It was a slow, painstaking process, but they were making progress. They were building a case against Harper, a mountain of evidence that they hoped would eventually bring him down. The road to her absolution, to their shared redemption, felt long. But they were closer than they had been. The town was beginning to stir. Chapter 16. A Promise Made in Gunsmoke. The evidence against Harper was mounting. Cass and his men had gathered sworn affidavits from ranchers who had been forced off their land, from merchants who had been extorted, from families who had been terrorized by Harper's hired guns. Maggie had used her influence to sway some of the more hesitant townsfolk, appealing to their sense of justice, their desire for a better, fairer community. They had even managed to secure the cooperation of a former employee of Harper's, a bookkeeper who had kept meticulous records of his illegal activities, his bribes to the sheriff, his fraudulent land deals, his systematic exploitation of the people of Redemption. "We have enough to bring him down, Maggie," Cass said, his eyes filled with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. "We can take this to the territorial governor, to the federal marshals. Harper won't be able to escape justice this time." But Maggie knew it wouldn't be that easy. Harper was a powerful man with powerful connections. He wouldn't go down without a fight. He would use every weapon at his disposal, every trick in the book, to protect himself, to maintain his grip on Redemption. "He'll know it was us," she said, her voice filled with a sense of foreboding. "He'll come after us, Cass. With everything he's got." Cass nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes hardening. "Let him come," he said. "We'll be ready." They knew they were walking into a trap, a showdown that was inevitable, a final confrontation that would determine the fate of Redemption, the fate of their lives. But they were prepared. They had made their plans, gathered their allies, steeled their resolve. They decided to present their evidence to the territorial governor, who was scheduled to visit a neighboring town in a few days. It was a risky move, exposing themselves to Harper's reach, but it was also their best chance of getting a fair hearing, of bypassing the corrupt local authorities. They set out early in the morning, a small, determined group, riding under the cover of darkness, hoping to avoid detection. But Harper's spies were everywhere. As they approached the outskirts of Redemption, they were ambushed. A volley of gunfire erupted from the surrounding hills, bullets whizzing past their heads, kicking up dust around them. Cass and his men returned fire, their movements swift and precise, their aim deadly accurate. Maggie, caught in the crossfire, ducked low in her saddle, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been in a gunfight before, never experienced the terror, the adrenaline, the raw, visceral fear of imminent death. The battle was fierce and brutal. Men fell, horses screamed, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Maggie saw one of Cass's men go down, a bullet piercing his chest. She saw Cass himself take a hit, a graze on his arm, but he kept fighting, his face grim, his eyes burning with a cold fury. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought with a courage, a determination that surprised even themselves. They were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for the future of Redemption. As the battle raged, Maggie saw an opportunity. A small group of Harper's men were flanking them, trying to get behind them, to cut off their escape. She spurred her horse, riding straight towards them, her shotgun raised, her finger on the trigger. She fired, the blast echoing through the hills, startling the men, throwing them off balance. She fired again and again, forcing them to retreat, to seek cover. Cass saw what she had done, his eyes widening in surprise, then admiration. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, her contribution to the fight. The battle continued, but the tide had turned. Cass and his men, inspired by Maggie's bravery, fought with renewed vigor, pushing back Harper's forces, forcing them to withdraw. They had survived the ambush, but they had paid a price. Several of Cass's men were wounded, one of them seriously. They were battered, bruised, but they were alive. And they still had the evidence. As they rode away from the scene of the battle, the smoke still lingering in the air, Cass turned to Maggie, his face filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something deeper, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "You saved us, Maggie," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You risked your life for us." She met his gaze, her heart swelling with a feeling she couldn't quite name. "We're partners, Cass," she said. "We fight together." He nodded. "I made a mistake, running. Now, I stand and fight. With you." It was a promise made in gunsmoke. Kept in blood. Chapter 17. Between Loyalty and Betrayal. The ride to the territorial governor was tense and arduous. They were constantly on guard, expecting another attack, their nerves frayed, their bodies exhausted. The wounded men were in pain, their conditions worsening, slowing their progress. They finally reached the town where the governor was staying, a bustling settlement that seemed a world away from the violence and corruption of Redemption. They secured lodging at a small, discreet inn, tending to the wounded, trying to rest, to regain their strength. Cass sent a message to the governor, requesting an urgent meeting, outlining the evidence they had gathered against Harper. The waiting was agonizing. They didn't know if the governor would believe them, if he would be willing to take on a man as powerful as Harper. The next morning, they received a reply. The governor would see them. He was intrigued by their claims, disturbed by the allegations of corruption and violence. He was willing to listen. They met with the governor in his temporary office, a large, opulent room in the town's grandest hotel. He was a stern, imposing man with a sharp mind and a reputation for fairness. He listened intently as Cass presented the evidence, the sworn affidavits, the bookkeeper's records, the testimonies of the victims. The governor was visibly shocked by the extent of Harper's crimes, the brazenness of his disregard for the law. He questioned them closely, probing for weaknesses in their case, testing their credibility. Maggie spoke passionately about the plight of the people of Redemption, about the fear and intimidation they lived under, about their desperate need for justice. She spoke from the heart, her voice filled with conviction, with a deep-seated sense of righteousness. The governor was impressed. He saw their sincerity, their determination, their unwavering belief in their cause. He believed them. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Boone, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice grave. "I assure you, I will take immediate action. I will send federal marshals to Redemption to arrest Harper and his men. And I will launch a full investigation into the corruption in your town." Relief washed over Maggie, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. They had done it. They had exposed Harper, secured the promise of justice. They had won. But their victory was short-lived. As they left the governor's office, they were met by a familiar face. Sheriff Thompson. He was standing in the hallway, his face grim, his hand resting on his gun. "Mr. Boone, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice cold and hard. "I'm afraid I have to place you under arrest." Cass's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. "On what charges, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Conspiracy, inciting violence, disturbing the peace," the sheriff replied, his gaze unwavering. "And aiding and abetting known criminals." Maggie's blood ran cold. They had been betrayed. Someone had tipped off Harper, warned him about their meeting with the governor. And the sheriff, despite his earlier show of sympathy, was still in Harper's pocket. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Cass said, his voice calm and steady, despite the rage that was building inside him. "We have evidence, proof of Harper's crimes. The governor has ordered his arrest." The sheriff smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "The governor has no jurisdiction in Redemption, Boone," he said. "And I'm the law here." He drew his gun, pointing it at Cass. "Now, I'm going to ask you to come with me quietly," he said, "or things are going to get ugly." Cass stood his ground, his eyes locked with the sheriff's. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. But he wouldn't surrender. He wouldn't let Harper win. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind them. "Drop the gun, Thompson." It was one of Cass's men, Jebediah, the tall, hawk-nosed man who had been the first to answer Cass's call. He was standing at the end of the hallway, his rifle aimed at the sheriff's head. The other men, who had been waiting outside, quickly joined him, their weapons drawn, their faces grim, their loyalty unwavering. They had Cass's back. They were ready to fight. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flickering between Cass and Jebediah. He was caught in a standoff, a deadly game of brinkmanship. He knew he was outmatched, that if he made a move, he would be a dead man. The tension in the hallway was thick, palpable. The fate of Redemption, the fate of their lives, hung in the balance. It was a moment of truth, a test of loyalty, a choice between justice and betrayal. The choice, it seemed, was entirely up to the sheriff. And, at his back, Harper's influence. He slowly lowered his gun. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. The sheriff's surrender was a turning point, a moment of profound significance. It signaled the beginning of the end for Harper's reign of terror, the crumbling of his carefully constructed empire of corruption and fear. With Thompson disarmed and under guard, Cass and his men, along with Maggie, returned to the governor's office. They explained the situation, the sheriff's betrayal, the imminent threat posed by Harper. The governor, outraged by the sheriff's actions, immediately dispatched a detachment of federal marshals to Redemption with orders to arrest Harper and his men and to restore order to the town. He also issued a warrant for Thompson's arrest, charging him with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The ride back to Redemption was filled with a mixture of relief, anticipation, and apprehension. They knew Harper wouldn't surrender without a fight, that a final showdown was inevitable. But they were ready. They had the law on their side, the support of the governor, and the unwavering loyalty of Cass's men. As they approached the town, they saw sight that made their hearts sink. Smoke was billowing from the direction of the Sullivan Ranch, a dark, ominous cloud against the clear blue sky. "He's burning us out," Maggie said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "He's destroying everything." Cass spurred his horse, his face grim, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "Not everything, Maggie," he said. "Not yet." They raced towards the ranch, their horses' hooves pounding the ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they drew closer, they could see the flames, the chaos, the figures of Harper's men running rampant, setting fire to the remaining buildings, rounding up the few livestock that had survived the previous attack. Harper himself was there, standing on the porch of the ranch house, watching the destruction with a cruel smile on his face. He was a tall, imposing man, with a hawk-like nose and cold, calculating eyes. He looked remarkably like Jebediah, Cass realized with chilling certainty. Cass and his men charged into the fray, their guns blazing, their voices raised in a battle cry. The federal marshals, who had arrived just moments before, joined the fight, their presence a powerful deterrent to Harper's men. The battle was fierce and brutal, a chaotic melee of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Men fell on both sides, the ground stained with blood, the air thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Maggie, despite her fear, refused to be a bystander. She grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen men and joined the fight, firing at Harper's men, protecting her home, her land, her future. Cass fought his way towards Harper, his eyes locked on his nemesis, his heart filled with a burning desire for revenge. He had waited years for this moment, for the chance to confront the man who had stolen his past, who had tried to destroy his future. He finally reached the porch, his gun leveled at Harper's chest. "It's over, Harper," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You're finished." Harper's smile faded, replaced by a look of fear, of desperation. He knew he was cornered, that his reign of terror was at an end. "You won't get away with this, Boone," he snarled. "I have friends, powerful friends. They'll make you pay." "Your friends can't help you now, Harper," Cass said. "You're going to jail. And you're going to pay for your crimes." Suddenly, a shot rang out, a bullet whizzing past Cass's head, narrowly missing him. He turned, his gun raised, searching for the shooter. It was Sheriff Thompson. He had escaped from his captors, somehow managed to get his hands on a gun. He was standing at the edge of the porch, his face contorted in rage, his eyes filled with hatred. "You won't take me alive, Boone," he shouted. He raised his gun, aiming at Cass. But before he could fire, another shot rang out. Thompson staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, then pain. He clutched his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He collapsed to the ground, dead. Maggie stood a few feet away, her rifle still smoking, her face pale, her body trembling. She had shot Thompson. She had saved Cass's life. Again. The remaining fighting quickly subsided. Harper's men, seeing their leader defeated, their sheriff dead, surrendered to the federal marshals. The battle was over. The war was won. As the smoke cleared, as the silence descended, as the reality of their victory sunk in, Maggie looked at Cass, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and love. He had a choice to make. Revenge or her. He holstered his gun. Chapter 19. Where Rivers Run with Regret. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of both devastation and relief. The ranch was in ruins, the buildings reduced to smoldering wreckage, the land scarred by fire and violence. But Harper was in custody, his men were disarmed, and the reign of terror that had gripped redemption for so long was finally over. The federal marshals set up a temporary headquarters in the town square, processing the prisoners, gathering evidence, restoring order. The townspeople, emboldened by Harper's downfall, began to emerge from their homes, offering their assistance, sharing their stories of his crimes. Maggie and Cass, exhausted but exhilarated, worked alongside the marshals, providing information, identifying Harper's accomplices, helping to piece together the shattered fragments of their community. As the days passed, a sense of hope began to return to redemption. The fear that had lingered for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism, a belief that things could finally change, that justice could prevail. Cass, despite his victory, found himself wrestling with a profound sense of emptiness. He had achieved his long-sought revenge, brought down the man who had ruined his life. But the satisfaction he had expected, the sense of closure, eluded him. He realized that revenge, while momentarily gratifying, couldn't erase the past, couldn't heal the wounds that had festered for so long. It couldn't bring back his father's ranch, his mother's love, his lost innocence. He looked at Maggie, at the woman who had stood by him, fought alongside him, risked her life for him. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in him. He saw the love in her eyes, a love that was both unexpected and transformative. He knew he had a choice to make. He could cling to the past, to the bitterness and resentment that had consumed him for years. Or he could embrace the future, the possibility of a new life, a new love, a new beginning. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the temporary shelter they had erected amidst the ruins of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the desert, he finally spoke his heart. "I've been a fool, Maggie," he said, his voice low and rough. "I've been chasing ghosts, letting my past define me, control me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding, with compassion. "We all have ghosts, Cass," she said. "We all have regrets. It's what we do with them that matters." "I want to do something different," he said. "I want to build something new, something good. With you." He reached out and took her hand, his grip strong and gentle. "I know I'm not the man you deserve, Maggie," he said. "I'm damaged, scarred, a man with a past that I can't escape. But I care for you."
Deeply.
Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed amidst the ashes of their shared struggles. "I care for you too, Cass," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I don't care about your past. I care about the man you are now, the man you're becoming." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their shared future. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of a love that had conquered all obstacles, overcome all doubts. As they held each other, watching the stars emerge, the vast expanse of the night sky a silent witness to their love, Cass felt a sense of peace, of belonging, that he had never known before. He had found his home, his heart, his redemption, in the arms of the woman who had believed in him, who had stood by him, who had loved him unconditionally. The river of regret that flowed through his life was finally beginning to slow, and maybe, just maybe, to change course, towards a brighter sea. He felt her squeeze his hand. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The rebuilding of the Sullivan Ranch became a symbol of redemption's rebirth. The townspeople, freed from Harper's grip, rallied around Maggie and Cass, offering their labor, their resources, their support. The spirit of community, long suppressed by fear and intimidation, blossomed anew, stronger and more vibrant than ever before. The ranch house, though damaged, was salvageable. With the help of skilled carpenters and masons, it was restored to its former glory, its walls echoing with laughter and warmth once more. New barns were built, fences mended, livestock replenished. The land, once scarred by fire and violence, began to heal, to flourish, to yield its bounty. Cass, working alongside Maggie, discovered a newfound purpose, a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. He found joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life, in the hard work, the honest labor, the tangible rewards of their efforts. He was no longer a drifter, a gambler, a man haunted by his past. He was a rancher, a partner, a man building a future. The legal proceedings against Harper and his accomplices moved forward swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning. Harper, stripped of his power and influence, was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to a long prison term, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The corrupt sheriff, Thompson, was dead, but his legacy of corruption was exposed and dismantled. A new sheriff was elected, a man of integrity and courage, committed to upholding the law and serving the people of redemption. As the town healed, as the ranch prospered, Maggie and Cass's love deepened, growing stronger with each passing day. They had faced adversity together, overcome obstacles, emerged victorious from the crucible of their shared struggles. They had found solace in each other's arms, strength in each other's hearts, redemption in each other's love. One evening, As they stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the desert, painting the sky in a breathtaking array of colors, Cass turned to Maggie, his eyes filled with a love that was both profound and enduring. He took a small, velvet box from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring, a diamond that sparkled in the fading light. "Maggie Sullivan," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "you are the love of my life, the woman who saved me, who showed me the meaning of hope, of redemption. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed down Maggie's face, tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had defied all odds, overcome all obstacles. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Cass," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of their eternal bond, their unbreakable commitment. He pulled her close, embracing her, kissing her with a passion that spoke of a lifetime of love, of devotion, of shared dreams. As they stood there, silhouetted against the fiery sunset, their hearts intertwined, their futures intertwined, they knew that their journey had just begun. They had faced the final confrontation of hearts and horizons, and they had emerged victorious, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a symbol of redemption found amidst the dust and shadows of the wild frontier. The vast landscape seemed to stretch out before them, not with challenges, but opportunities. Together, they had made a new horizon, a new beginning. Epilogue. The wedding was a celebration of love, of community, of a new beginning. The entire town of Redemption turned out, dressed in their finest clothes, their faces beaming with joy, with gratitude, with a shared sense of triumph. The ceremony took place beneath a sprawling oak tree on the grounds of the Sullivan Ranch, the branches adorned with wildflowers, the air filled with the sweet scent of blossoms and the joyous sounds of music and laughter. Maggie, radiant in a simple white dress, her eyes sparkling with happiness, walked down the aisle on the arm of old man Hemmings, the blacksmith, who had become a surrogate father figure to her. Cass, standing at the altar, his face etched with emotion, watched her approach, his heart overflowing with a love that was both profound and overwhelming. He had never imagined he could feel this way, that he could find such happiness, such peace, after a life filled with so much pain and regret. They exchanged vows, promises of love, of loyalty, of unwavering commitment, their voices clear and strong, their eyes locked in a gaze that spoke of a lifetime of shared dreams, of shared hopes, of shared destinies. The reception was a lively affair, filled with dancing, feasting, and heartfelt toasts. The townspeople, who had once lived in fear, now celebrated with abandon, their spirits lifted, their hearts filled with hope for the future. As the night wore on, as the stars emerged, as the music faded, Maggie and Cass found themselves alone on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the vast expanse of the desert, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. "We did it, Cass," Maggie said, her voice filled with a quiet contentment. "We saved the ranch. We saved redemption. We found each other." Cass took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We did it together, Maggie," he said, "and we'll keep doing it together. For the rest of our lives." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, loving kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their enduring love. It was a kiss that spoke of a future filled with promise, with happiness, with the quiet joy of a life well lived, a love well earned. The scars of the past remained, etched on their hearts, on their souls, but they were no longer a source of pain, of regret. They were a reminder of the battles they had fought, the obstacles they had overcome, the strength they had found in each other. As they stood there, hand in hand, silhouetted against the vast, starlit sky, they knew that their journey had been long and arduous, but it had led them to this moment, to this place, to this love. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they would face whatever the future held, together, their hearts united, their spirits unyielding, their love a beacon of hope in the vast, beautiful and sometimes brutal landscape of the